From the gospel passage we just heard, but I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. But love your enemies, do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. I've purposely taken snippets from this morning's gospel reading as my text for this sermon in order to focus our attention on love. In today's passage, which comes from Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus asks his disciples to do all kinds of things, to bless people who curse them, to pray for people who abuse them, to turn the other cheek, and to lend to anyone who asks for something they have. We could profitably talk about any one of these actions, but I want to talk about love, particularly about the command that is, at least in my opinion, pretty much impossible to obey, the command to love my enemies. Love is a single word with a lot of different meanings. There's romantic love, the love that's the subject of countless songs, the ones where we're told that love is a many-splendored thing, that love hurts, that love makes the world go round, and that everybody loves somebody sometime. Many songs ask questions about romantic love, questions like, will you still love me tomorrow? Can you feel the love tonight? And what's love got to do with it? There's, of course, Bob Dylan's Is Your Love in Vain, the Bee Gees' How Deep Is Your Love, and there are artists as dissimilar as Bob Marley and Whitesnake who get right to the point when they ask, is this love? Cole Porter asked pretty much the same question, but in his more elegant Cole Porter way, what is this thing called love? Well, I can say with complete assurance that romantic love is alive and well. As many of you know, I live above a supermarket, Myers Fairfax Market, at the corner of 105th and Cedar. The store was completely transformed during the days leading up to Valentine's Day. There were bouquets of roses, heart-shaped balloons, funny greeting cards, sincere greeting cards, risque greeting cards, and chocolate gifts of every possible kind. I had just gone down to try to buy a half a gallon of milk, not remembering that I would have to walk through Valentine Central. Love was even featured at the Super Bowl this year. And no, I'm not talking about the speculation that the Cleveland Heights native Travis Kelce would propose to T. Swift at halftime. I'm talking about love that's different from romantic love. You see, a different kind of love made it onto the field. If you look closely at the end zones where the Philadelphia Eagles were scoring touchdown after touchdown, you may have seen that one end zone was stenciled with a message, "It takes all of us," while the other end zone said, "Choose love." The end zone that said "Choose love" led Scott Simon, the longtime anchor for NPR's Weekend Edition, to ask a question. You may wonder, he said, how are professional football players who are paid gobs of money to bash, thrash, and smash each other before a vast worldwide audience supposed to represent choosing love? It's a darn good question. Well, after sharing some creative and pretty funny thoughts about how the two teams might do something that's so clearly at odds with the physical violence of the game of football, Simon ended his commentary by imagining a different conclusion to the Super Bowl game. He said, the two Super Bowl teams suddenly see their highly promoted competition as trivial stuff compared to the great game of life. They heed the commandment in the end zone to choose love. Well, I can tell you that it's unlikely that the National Football League got the idea of choosing love from Jesus, But their Super Bowl message isn't all that far removed from what Jesus was telling his disciples when he spoke to them the first time, and therefore is talking to all of us disciples now. Choose love. The question is, what might that look like? Or, to borrow Scott Simon's question, how are we supposed to represent choosing love? Let's begin by understanding what exactly Jesus is talking about when he uses the word love. It's important to be clear because there are no fewer than 6 words in the Bible that have been translated into our one English word, love. 2 of the 6 words come from the Hebrew Scriptures, 4 of them come from the Christian Scriptures. My guess is that in the past, someone has spoken from this very pulpit about the different words for love in the Greek New Testament. There's eros, of course. Our word erotic is derived from it. That's enough about that. There's caritas, a word that sometimes is translated charity. Caritas has the sense of a generous, freely given gift, like grace. There's phileo, a word that is now associated mostly with brotherly or sibling love, as in Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. However, none of these words is the word that Jesus uses when he tells his disciples to love their enemies. Jesus uses a 4th New Testament word for love instead, a word that you probably have heard before. The word is agape. It's a word associated with God's unconditional, unbreakable relationship of kindness, love, and mercy with us, so that we might live together with righteousness and justice and harmony and well-being. When Jesus quoted the great commandment from Deuteronomy and Leviticus about loving our neighbors as ourselves, agape is the word that he used for love. Thou shalt love, agape, the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love, agape, thy neighbor as thyself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. To choose the kind of love Jesus is talking about in today's gospel reading is to choose to love our enemies in the same way we are to love God and our neighbors. And that, my siblings in Christ, is a very tall order indeed. We can begin to appreciate how hard it would have been for those who were listening to Jesus speak. Think about who would be striking one of those early Jesus followers on the cheek. At the time of Jesus, those who struck you on your cheek or took away your coat were masters or soldiers. We know that some, if not many, of the first followers of Jesus were slaves. Masters could strike a slave on one cheek with the back of their hand as a way of punishing that slave for insubordination or disobedience. The penalty was both painful and humiliating. It was intended to be both painful and humiliating. And yet, here's Jesus telling his followers, some of whom are slaves, to turn the other cheek. Similarly, not just anybody would be taking away your coat. Typically, this person would be a soldier, and the taking away of your coat would be a form of extortion. Give me your coat, or else X is going to happen to you. The soldiers would have been Roman soldiers, certainly seen as the enemy by many, if not most, of the first Christians. And yet, here's Jesus telling his followers to give away their shirts, too, if someone demanded to have their coats. Turn the other cheek, Jesus? Really? Love my enemies, do good, and lend expecting nothing in return? Come on. Here's a story from just this past fall that illustrates how far from loving my enemies I am. They say confession is good for the soul, so I might as well get it started here. After Labor Day, the campaigns for national, state, and local candidates and issues were gearing up for the final push toward Election Day. Buying ads, passing out yard signs, holding rallies, everything was in full swing. At the meeting of the West Area Mission Council of Clergy in this diocese, the clergy were anticipating and preparing for what we knew was going to be a very challenging time. What were we going to do? And how were we going to respond to what was sure to be a divisive season ahead? A couple of clergy basically said, I'm going to dig a hole and crawl into it. I'm going to try to pretend that what's going on outside my church building isn't happening at all. Others talked about what they were going to do during their adult forums or formation activities. For example, at Trinity Toledo, where I was serving, we decided to do a series on civic life and faith with sessions about American civil religion, learning how to disagree without being disagreeable, spiritual disciplines and practices for the election season, and the troubling rise of Christian nationalism. One rector brought to the group what her church was going to do. They were going to have a campaign called the Neighbor to Neighbor Initiative, an initiative to encourage people to love their neighbors despite their differences. Would the other clergy at the clericus sign on in support? And would we be willing to pass out lawn signs the initiative was having printed? They were lime green signs with a big red heart on them. When you were driving by one of the signs, what you would see is, "Heart your neighbor." I told the rector, who was and is a good friend, that I'd have to think about whether Trinity could support what her church was doing. Now, on the one hand, it seemed like an easy thing to do. Heart your neighbor. What could be more Christian than that? In fact, heart your neighbor didn't go nearly as far as Jesus goes in today's gospel reading. Jesus says, heart your enemy. I thought and I prayed about it, and I talked with the wardens and vestry about it. And in the end, our discernment led us to say, no, we couldn't sign on. You see, Trinity had become a safe place for LGBTQIA+ people. It was a refuge for people who had experienced a lot of different kinds of trauma in their lives, especially church trauma. The senior warden was a married lesbian, and the junior warden was a married gay man. Several members of the church were trans, and before she left, the former rector had celebrated the Episcopal Church's beautiful renaming liturgy for a member. The renaming liturgy is a service of blessing for someone who has taken or been given a new name. The ceremony can be used for many different reasons, including divorce or choosing a new name or a gender transition. The service the rector celebrated from the church's book of occasional services was because a person had transitioned. So many painful statements were being made about people who were different in some of the campaigns. So much hatred was being directed at those people who were members of Trinity. And so many people were being othered that we could not bring ourselves to say that we could heart our neighbors. Was this unchristian? We certainly could have been accused of being unchristian, but maybe not as unchristian as the person whose house I drove by as we got close to Election Day, and I wish I'd taken a picture, a person who had proudly displayed "Heart Your Neighbor" in their front yard alongside some of the most revolting and vile signs that said detestable things about several different marginalized groups of people. So, how do we heart our enemies, while at the same time honoring our baptismal promise to strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? Let me say two things as we come to the end of this sermon. The first is that loving your neighbor, or your enemy for that matter, does not mean being a doormat. It would be unchristian, for example, not to mention unconscionable, to tell a woman in an abusive relationship that if her abuser strikes her on the right cheek, she should offer him the left cheek too. As Christians, we must always oppose evil and stand with those who have been victims of it. Loving one's enemy does not mean allowing that person to disrespect the dignity of another person or of any human being. And in the end, this was the reason we didn't feel we could sign on to the Neighbor to Neighbor program as a church. We said individual members were welcome to join the program, and many did, and put signs in their yards. The second thing is this. If we do love, if we do agape our enemies, then the ways we express dislike and opposition will always also express our total desiring of their well-being so that the whole world might be well. Our goal and our total desire are to be in relationship with them, the kind of relationship that God desires for both of us. Easy peasy? Absolutely not.